Okay, now we've seen the DTF at a macro level. If you've seen the last video, I'll try to put a link up so you can jump to it. But we looked at the actual print under the macro lens. And now what I want to do is look at it on the fabric so you can see what happens when this is heat pressed onto the fabric. What I'm going to use is a test file that we use to just see the resolution of a printer and then what resolution will actually adhere to a shirt under the heat press conditions. It's a great way for us to kind of gauge over time what's stable, what's not stable. Hopefully as we go through this video, that'll make more sense. So this is the file that we're using. We've actually printed. It's 12 inches wide. It has different resolutions from 35 to 45 to 55. Some would call it DPI, some would call it LPI. They can be a bit interchangeable. I'll do a different video on that at some point, but suffice it to say it's big dots to really, 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 really little dots. And where do they stick and where do they peel off? Let's take a quick look at this under the macro lens, and so you can see what that's going to look like, and then we'll show it to you on the print, and you can see how it actually materialized. So let's go over to the macro. Let's take a look at the 35 DPI line, or some people might call it the 35 lines per inch, right? And then there's different percentages of coverage, like 50%, 40%, 30%, etc. Now, let me just give you a brief explanation of what that means. So 35 DPI, or I would say 35 LPI, would mean that if you looked at the number of lines of dots here, you would have 35 separate columns of dots going down like this, 35 separate columns, and then 35 columns going across. So it makes kind of a grid, 35 by 35 grid in a way. And then when you say, well, okay, but in that grid, how much space does the ink dot actually take up? And in this case, we're looking at 50%. So you've got a 35 by 35 grid, and then in each grid space, it takes up 50% of the actual space within that grid. Now, let's drop down to 25%. So here we have a grid which is 35 by 35, and then in each one of those grid spaces, one of these individual dots takes up 25% of the grid that it's actually in. So that's where we're looking at there. So what we're going to do now is we're actually going to look at this after it's been heat pressed onto a shirt and see. But before we do that, let's actually take a look at the back side of this print. Okay, so here you can see we're looking at the same area. This is the 35. And then as we go down to the different percentage levels, 40%, 30%, 25%, you can see the dots get smaller. One of the things to notice here is look at the thermal polyurethane. You can see each one of these has a dot on it. I'm literally scraping it off there with this scraper. That's pretty fun. Okay, let's look way down. I was scraping that with a pretty sharp knife. And as you start to get smaller and smaller and smaller, now we're at, where are we at here? We're at 10% here. So that's a 35 by 35 grid, and each one of those grids, the ink takes up 10% of the space in there. Then we can get all the way down to, let's just say 5%. And what you'll see on 5%, which is interesting, is you start to see pretty sparse thermal polyurethane. Some of these dots don't have, let me refocus this. Some of these dots don't have any thermal polyurethane on them, and some do. Okay, we get even further. Now we're just basically seeing a little itty bit. This is really tiny. This is like 2%. And 35 DPI at 2% is just absolutely incredibly small. Now I've got this actually pressed onto a shirt. We'll take a look at this underneath the macro lens and then see where some of the dots have a difficult time adhering. Let's take a look. For sake of reference, we're going to use this little arrow mark written by a small ballpoint pen. Right, 35 DPI across the board. Let's look at this at the, here we go. So we're seeing this at 50%, and you can see how small those dots are and how well it's adhered to the ink. Let's go take a look at down at 30%. Okay, let's pull 30% into focus here. All right, so now we're looking at 35%. Now we're looking interestingly at round dots on the top and oblong dots on the bottom. So here, round dots, and then these are oblong dots. These dots are also angled at a, I believe at like a 20 or 30% angle. No, they're at 22.5 degree angle. So it's not straight up and down, but it's angled at 2.5 degrees. That's just a technique that that's a technique that you can use to not have weird visual effects. So looks like we're good at 25%, and then now let's move this up. Let's keep going down. Let's take a look. There's 25%. Let's look at 20%, and then at 20%, we're mostly stable, but I do see that right over here somewhere in the 20% range, I'm starting to see there's one dot that's missing there. It didn't stick. We start to see a few more dots falling off at 15%. So let's take a look at this 15%. So we're now at 35 LPI or DPI and 15% of the space being taken up. And here we're starting to see more dots fall off. Okay, now we're going to go down to the 10% level. And at the 10% level, we can see that we're having a little bit more difficulty keeping the dots on there. Let's jump down to 5%. It starts to get more and more sparse. They start to fall off. And then at 2%, we're really, really risky. You can still see them, but it's pretty risky. So what should you be taking away from this is there's a point at which the size of the dots, the size of the lines are stable. You know that they're going to adhere. So if you're making your own designs, if you're working with a customer, if you're communicating with the designer, you can kind of say, hey, this is like a best practice for where you don't want to go smaller, right, or thinner, because now you can see what happens with the print, and then when you heat press it, what it actually looks like on the actual garment. Now, one of the other things I want to do here is I'm going to try to scrape these off and show you how durable this is when they're pressed on there. So let's jump back up to where things look pretty stable, 20 to 25% at 35 DPI or LPI. We'll take a look at that under the macro lens, and I'll try to scrape it off with a pair of sharp scissors, and you can see the durability. So here is 20% at 35 LPI or DPI. I'm going to take these scissors here, and I'm going to just really try to scrape these dots off as hard as I can. I'm really giving this a good scrape. Let me get the sharp end here. I'm just wanting to see if I can scrape these dots off of here. Let's just really dive in there, and it takes, I'm really scratching this pretty hard right now. Okay, let me stretch. I'm starting to get a few of them to peel off, but I'm definitely damaging the fabric at the same time, so you can kind of see what I'm having to do to get these dots to fall off. Now, I feel like this is pretty darn abrasive, way more abrasive than a wash, and now you can see that I was able to scrape them away, but if you look closely, you can also see that I had to damage the fabric pretty good to get that to come away, and I think that's a lot more than what one could expect from anything from screen printing or DTF. So let's take a look. That's what it looks like under a macro lens. I hope that was helpful in understanding how the design decisions that you make about the size of dots and lines are really going to impact the final product, and understand that there's some baselines that you can kind of rely on and some areas where things start to get just a little bit risky just from the physical nature of how a DTF print works, how the ink is laid down onto the substrate, how the white backing is then put onto the back of that, and then how the thermopolyurethane goes on the back of that, and then when you finally heat press it, how it actually melts into, adheres to the fabric, what that looks like. up close under a macro lens, and that should allow you to have a lot more knowledge and inform your design decisions and maybe easier communication with your clients and your partners. Okay, I'm Paul from Pro Transfers, and we'll keep doing this in the future, so stay tuned, like, and subscribe.